Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being our readers. Thank you for being our angels. And thank you for your support for the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival, now in year 6. We started in 2014 at a ticket price of $125. I bet you all wish that were still the case. But, you know, things happen. And we had 30 authors and 300 readers. We are now up to 800 readers and 175 angels. Have a much higher price point. But we thank you all very, very much for being part of this. And I was saying to Jay as we were chatting in the green room, part of this festival that you'll notice is we do not have a lot of novelists. We do not have a lot of fiction writers. That's intentional. We really think that many of you, and we hope this is true, it's kind of done without a Gallup poll, many of you really favor and prefer nonfiction so that you'll learn history, politics, etc. And that's what this festival is. It's emerging as an idea festival, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So again, thank you all. To the 6th annual.
Thank you for having
me. Is it working? Is it spotty or what? I think if I bend the head, it doesn't work. So Jay, if I don't look right at you, it's not out of lack of friendship. It's out of technology. I think that's. How's it going?
It's not working. Is there somebody here who can? Do we have a mic person?
June, can we get the
Technical person? Well, thank you all for coming.
well stated, Jay.
Our 6th year of doing this. We are very proud.
And we're getting there. Okay, I thought what I would begin with is a compliment to Jay. I like to butter up our intellectuals so they're not too rough on the moderator. And in Jay's case, I would describe what he does and what he writes as the most readable story of big, big history. By big history, he has written about the French Revolution. He has written about World War II, which is our topic today, and so many other major, major historical moments. And he writes it almost as literature because it flows so beautifully.
Okay, because okay.
And his development of character is critical, as you'll see in this book, 1944. So I thought where we would begin, Jay, is with the simplest question that any interviewer can ask: why 1944?
Why 1944? I mean, I guess in a sense, the reason I chose 1944 is before that, I'd written this book on April 1865, which was about a critical month in American history at the end of the Civil War. You can't hear me?
Yeah, just a little closer, that's it.
Okay, now can you hear me? Welcome once more.
A rousing good start here, isn't it?
Okay, why 1944? Well, what I do in my books is I pick great historical moments that are turning points in which they're a major hinge in history. And I've written about the Civil War in my book, April 1865. I've written about the Revolutionary Era and the French Revolution with my book, The Great Upheaval. And I was casting about for another topic. And then it occurred to me, as I was reading and researching and thinking about World War II, just how profound this year 1944 was. Let me just give you 3 strands about what the book's about. The first part of the book is about FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, and unknown to history and little known to the American people, in the critical year 1944, he was actually a sick and dying man. He was so sick and so in such bad shape that he was coughing. He could barely sign a signature. His face was drooping. When he was in the Oval Office, he had trouble even to the Oval Office. That he had actually fallen out of his wheelchair and fallen on the ground. Dying. Things are happening in 1944. The first thing that's occurred not only in the entirety of the war, but perhaps in the 20th century, and that was the impending invasion. And that was the humanitarian crisis probably the most significant humanitarian crisis the world had ever seen. And that was the gassing of up to 1 million Jews in Auschwitz. And all this is happening at one time. And I thought that's a story to be written about.
Well, perfect answer, as we would expect. And please tell us your volume 1944 ends with this. I will not look at Jay. So again, this is not out of lack of friendship or respect. It's the technology. So Jay, your book begins with the Sphinx. Your book begins in the desert. Your book begins in a most unlikely location. Please explain how that location is so critical to what followed.
Well, as David says, the setting for the opening of the book is it's not in Washington, it's not in the Soviet Union, it's not in Europe, it's at the pyramids and the Sphinx in Egypt. And the reason why I do that is because in late 1943, Roosevelt would meet with Winston Churchill. And one day while Roosevelt was in his villa, Churchill burst into the villa and he said, "My God, Mr. President, I have something we have to do. We must go see the pyramids. We must go see the Sphinx. I've arranged it all." And Roosevelt got so captivated by Churchill's enthusiasm, by his presence, by his excitement, that he actually tried to lift himself up and walk without his wheelchair. And of course, he couldn't do that, but his knuckles got awfully red. But then he says, "Okay, Mr. Prime Minister, let's do it." And so they got into the car, they motored over to the pyramids and to the Sphinx, and the sun was setting, and the mountains were becoming more visible in the background. And eventually they looked at the pyramids, but then they saw the Sphinx. And as they looked at the Sphinx, they looked at it from one angle, then another angle, then another angle. And then they sat down, and the pink line of dawn was being erased. And then eventually Churchill looks over to Roosevelt, and he thinks to himself, "My God, I love this man." And then in response, what did FDR say? Well, FDR said nothing. Now, the reason why I started out with the Sphinx is because I think FDR, as this critical year of 1944 is about to happen, he was like the Sphinx. He was unknowable. It was impossible to know what was filtering in his mind and in his heart and in his thoughts. So that was why I chose that to open up the book.
Wouldn't it be fair to say as well that Stalin was something of a sphinx? Stalin was an unknown quantity, and Stalin had begun the war as an ally of Hitler and then switched sides, as we say, and was critical to what would happen and had this enormous army, had to be with us, came to our side, but he remained something, what Churchill called him, a mystery wrapped in an enigma. That's pretty Sphinxian.
Inside of a riddle.
Oh, right. So where does Stalin fit in? Your development, we were chit-chatting by email, your development of, I think, the psyche of these three men is remarkable. You really get, when you're finished with 1944, you really have a greater sense of who FDR was. We know FDR historically. We know the significance. We know the leadership. We know the Depression. We know World War II. We think we do, and some background. But I think what you've provided is a psychological component of FDR and of Churchill, less so of Stalin, because again, he remained this enigma.
Yeah, no, that's really well stated. One of the things that's so fascinating about this period is that FDR would meet with Churchill as well as with Stalin. And when he first met with Stalin, he had never met before. They had corresponded. Obviously, the Soviet Union started out the war on the side of the Nazis, and then eventually they switched after the Nazi invasion of the Soviets. And then Stalin was just desperate for the West to open up a second front. And of course, that would later become D-Day. But I want you all for a minute just to think of this first meeting between Roosevelt and Stalin. Roosevelt's in his wheelchair in a room. Stalin's brought in to see him. And as Stalin comes in, he looks up and he looks down. And all of a sudden, he realizes that Roosevelt is in a wheelchair, and he realizes he can't walk. And he just gazes for a few minutes at these shriveled legs. And at the same time, FDR is looking at Stalin, and he's sizing him up. He sees a man who's not very tall, but he's got great bearing. He's got great presence. He notices his skin is kind of pocked, and he smokes a lot. And they actually got along fairly well. But having said that, Stalin was a little cool, and FDR thought he could turn on his legendary charm, which always worked in the Oval Office in Washington, but it didn't have much impact on Stalin himself.
I think it would be helpful to step back now, away from 1944 for a bit, which is how did we get there? And let's talk about isolationism in the United States, late 30s going into the 40s. Europe is on fire. Hitler is clearly marching, succeeding mightily. Churchill is absolutely fiercely begging the Americans to get involved. Many Americans are thinking, we've got to get involved. But here we had a very strong, well-positioned, politically powerful force of isolationism in this country. I'm rambling a bit to get to this point. Wouldn't isolationism have been a pretty likely result of the war to end all wars, World War I, which was so graphically horrific, with so many deaths and so much destruction? Wouldn't there be an understanding of isolationism? Can we have an understanding of isolationism?
Yeah, this is a very important question, the question of isolationism. It actually bears on America's role in the world today. But the thing to think about is, could we or should we have gotten into the war earlier? But as David mentioned, weren't the memories, think about World War I. It was just so ghastly. It just was an ocean of blood and an ocean of tears, and it seemed to go on almost forever. And for the American people, looking at it, what they saw as Europe's wars, Europe's carnage, Europe's horror. Just many Americans didn't want any of that. They thought, why do we have to go over once more, send our boys to fight, send our boys to die, or send our boys to get maimed, when it's to do nothing but to help Europe with its wars. And so that was sort of the American psyche and the American mood for quite some time. But then as Hitler just became increasingly aggressive, as he seized one country after another, and it was clear that he was ready to make a lunge for Britain itself, that civilization itself was in peril. And at this point, Churchill, as the rest of Europe was being gobbled up by the Nazi armies, by the Blitzkrieg, Churchill was desperate, and he frantically and frenetically kept writing to FDR saying, Mr. President, in the time of the world, this is a time when you must act. In the time of the world, this is when we need your help. And Roosevelt was playing quite coy. He refused into the war in the beginning. He laid back. And now think about this for a second. When we think of Roosevelt, we think of a president who was one of the greatest communicators we've ever had sitting in that office. Think of him speaking in his fireside chats, how he uplifted the hearts of all Americans and all young men and women. Think of how he gave speeches that would rouse the country to do wonderful things. Think of America in the midst of the Depression, something that was so great and so vast and so frightening to America that there were those who thought we could actually turn communist. And yet Roosevelt, with his words, with his charm, with his presence, with his charisma, was able to get the American people moving. So he got us through the Depression. So with Hitler taking over one country after another in Europe, why wouldn't he come to our defense? Well, there was a powerful isolationist movement. In part, it was sort of headed up by Charles Lindbergh, of course, the great war aviator. And many American people just didn't have the stomach for it. But the other thing that we have to think about is, why didn't FDR try to lead public opinion? And that remains to this day a big question. Most historians will say, well, Roosevelt didn't want to get too far out ahead of public opinion. But my God, this was civilization in its midst that was in peril. If ever there were a time for Roosevelt to get out in front, this was it. But he was still unwilling to until the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Do you think that we've chatted about this very briefly, but do you think for our readers to perhaps jump into this as well as us, where was the anti-Semitism of the United States of America circa, say, 1938? Here we have Kristallnacht, which should be a pretty clear indication of what the Nazis had in mind, probably the clearest to that point. I think everything else was sort of mist and fog, and they can't really be doing this. But Kristallnacht said, yes, they're really doing this. The attack on Jews is really now overt and very public. How anti-Semitic was America during those years? I'm guessing that it was pretty darn anti-Semitic, with country clubs segregated, and it was in the DNA of the United States of America in that period, I would contend. Do you agree with that? And do you think that might have been why Roosevelt was so sluggish, it seemed, certainly to Churchill and to Jews realizing what was happening in Europe? I'm rambling again, but do you think that anti-Semitism was part of this, part of the delay of our entry?
Well, I mean, it's a tough question and it's a sensitive question. And I guess one way of thinking about it is that there was a kind of polite or genteel anti-Semitism. The America in 1938, 1939, 1940 is certainly not the America of 2018 or 2019. And I don't think many Americans, or most Americans, would have stomached or would have had the thought of the fire in their belly to go to a great war over the Jews. And of course, when Kristallnacht happened, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's when Nazi mobs went rampaging through the cities of Germany, and they destroyed Jewish businesses, they set torch to the synagogues, they burned books, they roughed up or they killed Jews just simply because they were Jewish. It was really a terrible thing. When Churchill looked at it, he thought, my God, this is an affront to all of civilization. And even Roosevelt was indignant about it. But at the time, I don't think it was, the American people weren't ready to open up another front just for the Jews.
So at that time, the thought was we must help England. I mean, the thrust of Churchill's message to Roosevelt and the internal wranglings within the White House and beyond in the inner circle of Washington, D.C. was about supporting England. Is that correct?
Yeah, because if England fell, then really civilization was going to fall itself. That would have meant that America would have been an isolated island, and who knows what the future would have held. I mean, we might have had to have made a pact with Hitler at that point. And so Churchill, as I said earlier, he was just desperate. And then at one point, Churchill sat down, almost with tears in his eyes, and he spent almost a week on composing what would be a 20-page letter to the president saying, Mr. President, in the time of the history, this is the time when we need your help more than any other period. And Roosevelt actually took a week off, and he went on a ship to kind of vacation and collect himself and strengthen his energies. And he thought about it, he thought about it. He didn't even bother to talk to his aides, and he came up with this idea, this brilliant, ingenious idea that would later be called Lend-Lease, in which we would help out financially Britain, as well as giving them weapons and machinery and things of that sort. And this was sheer genius on Roosevelt's part. And Roosevelt was quite funny. After his vacation was over, he went back to the White House, and he called in a press conference. And his little dog Fowler jumped up on his lap, and he was laughing and joking with the press. And he talked about how, well, this is like my loaning a fire hose to a neighbor. And the press never even thought about what it really meant. But this was Roosevelt's way of giving significant aid to the British who desperately needed it, and doing it without going through the gamut and the problems of Congress.
And Lend-Lease, just in a nutshell, Jay, how did Lend-Lease work?
Well, Lend-Lease, I mean, we were going to loan old weaponry, tanks and ships and things.
We have one.
What was funny is the implication was always that they would lend it back. They were never going to. So charming, Roosevelt, how we did this.
The key to this.
Congress, the American people. This was the first step towards getting into war without actually getting into the war.
Well, the garden hose is so neat and tidy and visual that you can't, that could sell anything.
Right.
And that's Roosevelt at his very, very best. The Holocaust was raging during these years and really getting perfected, an ugly word for death camps. How is it? I've often wondered, how cognizant was Roosevelt about the extent of Auschwitz, of the murder of Jews? How cognizant was Roosevelt? It seems as if he didn't really either buy into it being factual or almost was oblivious to it.
Well, this is, and it's what I want to do is I want to answer this in two different parts. Let me first talk about the Holocaust and actually rounding up, and they would take all their possessions and then they would put them, shut them into boxcars of trains, and they'd be wedged in so tightly that grandmothers, grandfathers, and little children, and boys, and girls, and train cars that they could. To the left, you were going to the God. Carefully, very smoothly, and nefariously, they were hiding actually what was going to happen. They suggested to the Jews, you're being taken here, you're just going to be deloused, you're just going to be showered, you're just going to be cleaned from your long trip. And they would be taken in, and there would be hooks on the walls. And they were told, put your clothes on the hooks, you will get them afterwards. And then they would hear children again screaming, I want to be with my mommy, I want to be with my daddy. And the Nazis very cleverly would say, yes, afterwards, you will be with your mother. Yes, afterwards, you will be with your father. And then after that, they would eventually be shunted into these rooms that were cold, that were forbidding, that were cold and forbidding. This just kind of threw me off a little bit. Sorry, guys. And they'd be packed in like stones packed in a driveway. And they could barely breathe. They were naked. They were shivering. They were cold. And all of a sudden, the lights, actually like this, the lights would go on and the lights would go off, and the screaming would begin. These people were so terrified. And then usually nothing would happen. And the reason is because in the beginning, the SS were just toying with the Jews. They were basically just frightening them and scaring them. And then eventually they would hear hiss, like this hiss. And from the ground would come this gas. And all of a sudden they couldn't breathe. And they would all rush to the door. And little kids would be trampled often by their own parents. They were so terrified. and they would be screaming, and eventually the screaming would become nothing but a death rattle, and eventually the death rattle would become nothing, and it would be just silence. Within 15 to 20 minutes, they would all be dead. So that was what the Holocaust was about. And this was happening every day, every hour, for weeks on end, for months on end. Some million Hungarian Jews were in jeopardy in 1944. And if you think about that, just think of how many people go into the Super Bowl. So it'd be like 10 Super Bowls of people being sent to their deaths. Now, the other part of your question is what did Roosevelt know? And of course, the Germans, Hitler, for all his nefariousness, for all his evil ways, even he understood the world was not ready to know the full extent of what the Germans and Nazis were doing to the Jews. So it was kept carefully hidden. But what did Roosevelt know? Well, in 1942, a small delegation went in to see him and said, "Mr. President, we are hearing reports. The Jews are in peril, the whole entire Jewish race." And Roosevelt one time he sat there and he had a Jewish delegation, and when he didn't want to talk about things, he was just this kind of smiling raconteur. So he told all these jokes and he just told stories, and then at the end he said, "You just tell your people that I'm fully aware of what's happening and I will take care of things." But of course in 1942 he didn't take care of things. 1943, the same thing. He had several people come in to see him, including one person who had actually had an eyewitness account. He was a Polish colonel, and he told the president what was taking place as well. And Roosevelt shook his head and he said, "I understand," but still he did nothing.
Now, Breckinridge Law was an advisor to FDR and a noted anti-Semite. Would he have the kind of sway that could, in a sense, say to Roosevelt, "Oh, it's not as bad as you're hearing," or "It isn't necessary, Mr. President, to plunge a nation into war to stop something that we can't confirm"? Would that be a message from Breckinridge Law?
Well, just to round out who Breckinridge Long is Breckinridge Long was Roosevelt's man in the State Department who was responsible for immigration. So as all this was taking place with the Holocaust, as there were the Kristallnachts, as there were the roundups, as there were the ghettos, the Jews were scared and terrified, and they started cramming the consulates of countries all around Europe. And of course, all they desperately wanted, was a visa to come to America or to go somewhere where there could be free. And Breckinridge Long was very hardline about this, and he sent out a memo, a very famous memo, in which he said very powerfully, he said to his people around consulates in Europe, and he said, by various administrative devices, we can postpone and postpone and postpone the giving of visas to the Jews. And he said it not once, not twice, but 3 times. And at one point, Eleanor Roosevelt got very concerned about what was happening, and she went to FDR and she said, "What about this Breckinridge Long?" And she said, "I think he's an anti-Semite." And Roosevelt just shook his head and he said, "Oh, come on, Eleanor, don't give me any of that sob stuff." So Long was really responsible for keeping many Jews from coming to freedom. And of course, in the case, unlike with immigrants today, if you were Jewish and you were cramming a consulate and you were trying to get out, and if you didn't, it didn't mean you were going to live an unpleasant life. It didn't mean that you may live in penury or poverty. It meant that you were eventually slated to die in a death camp.
The ship to St. Louis came out of Hamburg, Germany, with 937 Jews
They
aboard.
can't hear you.
Oh, you're not hearing? Well, maybe I should use this then as well. This could turn into stereo. The famous ship, the St. Louis, came out of Hamburg, Germany, and had 937 Jews aboard, and was making its way to Havana. Well, the Cuban government said, "No way, you're not landing here." So the ship set off north to eventually New York Harbor. It actually, I think, stopped in Miami and also in the Carolinas, if I'm not mistaken, and then New York. So we'll ask Jay what happened next.
Well, this is a very famous incident where in 1939, some 900 passengers, mostly Jews, they were trying to make their way to freedom, and Cuba wouldn't take them, so they eventually went to Miami. And of course, when they got to Miami, they had to be given permission to land. And they appealed to the State Department, and what did the State Department say? They said nothing. So for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, they just kind of moored off the shores of Miami, and they could actually see the buildings light up at night. And then people came out in small little ships. They even rowed out to them, and they were bringing them food. They brought them water. They brought them clean clothes, and just day after day, they kept appealing to the State Department, to the president, please can we enter? And eventually they heard nothing, so they were forced to turn around. And as a result, out of the 900 Jews, some 2/3 of them eventually died in death camps. And why this was so tragic is because this was an example of America really hardening its heart and turning away those who most needed help.
Yes, I need the mic, thank you. So after Pearl Harbor, the United States, regardless of the isolationists and with the earlier brilliant idea of Lend-Lease, was fully engaged in World War II. Really a huge startup of converting automobile factories to tank factories, et cetera. But by the time we get to 1944, the tide is turning, I'm thinking, so it looks better for the Allies, and maybe Hitler's insanity and complete evil had begun to consume him so much he was making poor decisions. But the point of this is that the moment that you're really a centerpiece of your book, of course, is D-Day, June 6th, 1944. Please tell our readers about the preparation for that, Eisenhower's role, of course, as Supreme Commander, and how D-Day played out.
Right. I mean, D-Day really is one of the great events in all of human history, certainly, and without a doubt in World War II. And basically what we were doing is this was going to be the great second front. We had the Soviets fighting the Nazis on the Eastern Front, and then we would open it up on the Western Front. And it would be what they would call at the time as the greatest armada ever assembled. And of course, so when they were about to launch the invasion, it turned out that the weather was not cooperating. Great windstorms covered hundreds of miles, and it was literally impossible to launch an invasion within this. And at this point, Eisenhower assembled his top advisors, and he polled what should they do. And they went from one general after another to another, and nobody was quite ready at the time actually to initiate the invasion in these storms. And so Eisenhower kind of paused for a second, and then he said in a very soft voice, he said, okay then, let's meet in another day. And so they met in another day, and once more the great windstorms were continuing, again over several hundred miles. And Eisenhower said, okay, we need to have one more meeting. So he went back to his bunk. He slept for a few hours. He got up, he had a shave, and he came back and he spoke to his meteorologist. And this time the meteorologist said, I think we will have a break in the storm of some 36 hours. And so this was the opportunity. So Eisenhower polled everybody, and then he finally said, and this is a very famous statement of his, he said, I don't know how much longer we can let this invasion hang out on a limb. And at that point he said, okay, let's go. And as he said, let's go, all the men began clapping, and they began cheering, and some of them had tears in their eyes. And so this was going to be the greatest invasion ever. And then as the invasion was about to begin, I want you to see it for a second from the German perspective. The Germans were in France, where the Americans were coming, and there was nothing there. They just saw some storm clouds, they saw water, and then everything was quiet. And all of a sudden, Rommel, who was there the day before, they saw a ship, and then another ship, and then another ship. And then eventually, all they could see was nothing but ships. And the Americans were coming, and they were coming fast. Well, they would land at 5 different vantage points, places like Gold and Juno and Sword, and things would happen very quickly. The Americans and our allies quickly mopped up the Germans. But on Omaha Beach, it was a very different thing. It was just pure carnage. This is where the Germans were most heavily fortified, and our men would be getting out of their landing craft, and they would be mowed down. Their heads were being blown off. They were bleeding into the waters. And eventually they were losing all their top military commanders. And it looked like the invasion here at Omaha was actually in peril. And then eventually a few young soldiers who were not commanders, they took the command and they said, we might as well die on the beaches as we do in the water. And so they came forward, and the Americans kept pushing and pushing and pushing, even as they were mowed down. And by the end of the day, they had prevailed. And at one point, one airman said, and God, what a statement this was, he said, Hitler must have been mad to declare war in the United States. And wherever you looked, you saw American tanks, you saw American vehicles, you saw American soldiers. And basically what had happened is this was the success of D-Day, and now it became clear that not that America may win the war, we knew we'd win the war. Roosevelt knew we'd win the war. It was just a question of how quickly we would. And it was very interesting. In Roosevelt's case, he had hoped to go over and actually see the invasion from London, but because of his health, he was unable to. But he picked up the phone. He was wearing a light sweater, and Marshall was on the phone, General Marshall, and Marshall said to Roosevelt, he said, the light of battle is in our men's eyes. And at that point, Roosevelt, whose hand was shaking when he had picked up the phone, he said, good, 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 and they had tears in their eyes. And so this was the great D-Day, the great military turnaround. This was going to make clear that we would win the war. And of course, even as now the empire of the military machine, the empire of war was being corroded, there was only one thing now working for the Nazis, and that was the empire of death, the fires at Auschwitz. So with us succeeding on the military front, what it did was it freed us to do more to help the Jews. And the question was, in 1944, would we?
I had originally thought when we were not chatting, but prepping for this, I thought a good question might be, is there ever a good war? And I think the way you've described D-Day and described the fall of the Third Reich and described the liberation of Jews from Auschwitz and death camps, there can certainly be a good war. Definitely. And we mentioned last night that Auschwitz was bombed. There was an issue of whether or not to bomb a Nazi death camp. And please tell our readers about what happened.
Okay, I'm going to backtrack just for a second to lay waste to the idea that Roosevelt didn't know what was going on. In 1944, another thing very profound happened. Well, at Auschwitz, there were these two men, Sidney Verba and Alfred Wetzler, who weren't sent to the gas chambers. They were lucky. They were actually registrars. And they knew everything that was taking place in Auschwitz. They knew what trains were coming in. They knew where they were coming from. They knew how many Jews were on each of these trains. They knew what was happening in the crematoria. They knew what was happening in the gas chambers. And they had decided that, my God, with so many Jews now in peril, 1 million in just 3 months alone, we have to do something. So they resolved they would try to escape from Auschwitz. And actually one night they made their way into a wood pile. They hid themselves actually in a wood pile, and they smeared oil on it. And then for 3 days, the Germans went looking for them. There were barking dogs. There were the SS. There was the Gestapo. There were their commanders roaming all of Auschwitz. And yet for 3 days, one long day after another long day after another, they couldn't find them. And at one point, German shepherds were sniffing on these wood piles, and they sniffed and sniffed, and yet eventually they couldn't figure out that Wetzler and Verba were there. So after 3 days, the search was actually called off within the confines of Auschwitz itself. And it was nighttime, and Wetzler and Verba, they pushed the open of the wood pile open, and they made their way out, and they turned around, and what did they see? They saw these great fires. And of course, for the first time, they were seeing the fires of Auschwitz from a different vantage point. And at that point, then they ran, and they ran as fast as they could, and they never stopped. They went for some 3.5 weeks. They escaped search parties for them. They escaped the Gestapo. They escaped the SS. They escaped anti-Semites. And eventually, they made their way to Croatia, where they met with some of the elders of the town who were still there. And they realized when they told them that this was still happening, the Jews were still in peril. They wrote up a 36-page memo that was sent to Washington and eventually made its way to the White House. And it was clear at this point that there was no doubt what was happening. They had the most unimpeachable information possible. So the question is now finally, at long last, would the sick and ailing Roosevelt do something to help the Jews who were so imperiled? And what was the answer? Well, the answer from John McCloy in the Pentagon is we can't fly that far. He said our planes just won't reach. Well, it turns out with the success of D-Day, we had new airfields in Italy, and it also turns out that routinely we had planes flying in and over and around Auschwitz for weeks on end as part of what was called the rubber war to degrade the Nazi war machine. So that was nothing but a lie. Of course we had planes that could fly that far. And another thing that was said is that if we bomb Auschwitz, we'll kill the Jews. Well, the answer to that, as one aide wrote in the Treasury Department, he said, these Jews are slated to die anyway. Well, at least let's do it trying to free them. And then another thing that was said is we can't afford a diversion of planes to fly over to Auschwitz. Well, it turns out that in another operation, when the Polish Home Army had risen up against their Nazi masters and they were being massacred, with the British joining us, with Roosevelt and Churchill joining hands for this operation, they sent planes that for 4 days kept sending supplies to the embattled Polish Home Army. And they did this knowing full well it would not turn the outcome, but at least it would send a powerful moral statement to the world. So the question is why not send a moral statement for the beleaguered Jews in behalf of common humanity? And then Churchill, when he heard about this, he said immediately, he said, my God, this is the greatest crime that we have ever seen in the history of mankind. And he said to his aides, we have to do something. Try to bomb the camps if you can. Use my name. Get everything you can out of it. And what happened out of America? Nothing. Still, we did nothing. And then finally, much to the surprise of everyone, as we later learned, we did bomb Auschwitz, but we bombed it by mistake. And as we bombed it, I want you to think about this for a second. These Jews were so tired and worn and emaciated and literally dying just on their feet that they could barely sit, they could barely stand. And yet when they saw these planes come over, when they saw these bombs fall, they stood and they cheered. And I had this conversation with the great Elie Wiesel before he died. And he was in Auschwitz at the time, and he was a young boy. And he said, we may have feared death, but we did not fear that kind of death. And of course, on the lips of all these Jews, always was the refrain, when will the Allies come? When will the Americans come? And they never came.
You've given us a tremendous portrait, Jay, of what you, I think, contend is the most important year of the 20th century, 1944. And as we have a digital readout here as we're wrapping up, I wanted to ask you, as former librarian here and a couple of other places, and the love of what we have in this library and in all libraries, tell us just a bit, if you can, about your research methodology. As quickly as you can.
What do we have, a minute?
Yeah, we have a minute. So.
Oh my God, that's not very much.
Give us a minute on research.
All right, what I try to do is I take something that people have thought about, written about, and seen many times over, and I'm told that if I have a talent or a skill or a genius, it's that I see things differently and I see these turning points. What I try to do in my research is I always try to give you something fresh, something new. My narrative skills are what I'm told I most excel at, and it'll read like a novel. And what I try to do is I try to give you something, and I try to transport you into the world I write about. And when you put that book down, what I want you to say, and what I'm told by many readers they do say, is they feel like they've been transported to that whole other world, and it's as if they lived by it. I want you to feel like it was you as if you were there.
Thank you so much, Jay Winik. Thank you again to our readers.